In this review for Spooky Ventures, Spooky Review, we're going to be looking at the new movie Color Out of Space. Now, it was released for a limited theatrical run in January, but it just came out on home video. Now, for those who don't know, the two biggest stars in the movie, at least the two that I recognize, were Nicolas Cage and Tommy Chong. May seem odd that Tommy Chong's in a horror movie, but interestingly enough, he's now writing a horror movie for Cheech and Chong, so that's kind of a cool thing. In any event, what I'm going to do with this video is I'm going to sort of talk about the movie in general, and then I'm going to sort of talk about it in comparison to the Lovecraft story, and finally, there's going to be a section at the end with some spoilers, because I don't want, if you haven't already seen the movie, I don't want to ruin it for those who have. I want to kind of discuss that. So first we'll look at the movie in general, so we'll get to that in a second. So one of the things they had to do, obviously, I mean, they could have done a period piece, I suppose, but they made changes to the Lovecraft story, and then they brought it into the modern day. Now, as a movie, let me just sort of talk about that. The film starts off kind of slow. The first introduction section is a little on the slow side. But I thought once it gets going, it's really just, it gets crazier and crazier. It's a very, very terrifying movie, actually. I like the fact that there's sort of a psychedelic feeling to it. And I know a lot of people think, after reading Strange Sound of Cthulhu, a lot of people think that I'm not a fan of the Stuart Gordon movies. That's actually not true at all. I like them. I just sort of isolated them from the Lovecraft stuff, because when I did that about Lovecraft music inspired by Lovecraft, honestly, I think that the ones that are strictly based on the Stuart Gordon movies don't qualify, because they're not based on the text of Lovecraft. So it's not that I don't like those movies. Now, the reason I bring that up is I think that once it sort of gets itself going and it's just crazy, over the top, I'm definitely reminded a bit of the Stuart Gordon movies. Now, this seems more serious. It's not quite so, I don't know, crazed perhaps, but it does get very crazed, actually. Also, some of the creature effects later in the movie made me think of John Carpenter's The Thing. I suppose you can't really do something like that without those comparisons, because that was such a groundbreaking film. But in general, I thought it was a very, very good film, and I enjoyed it very much. It was kind of everything I hoped it would be, at least once it got going. Like I say, that opening section I found to be kind of a little overly slow. Perhaps that's meant to set it up as a contrast between the craziness that happens after. But, you'll see. Maybe your mileage will vary on that. I thought all the acting was good, with one exception. The lady, and I'm not going to try to pronounce her name, but the lady who played the mayor of the town, I really thought her performance was pretty wooden and unbelievable. But everyone else, I thought, did a great job in the movie. There's a little something I'm going to talk about Nicolas Cage in the spoiler part. The soundtrack works so well for the movie, too. There's one other aspect of the movie I realized I wanted to talk about, too, after I recorded the intro, which is the effects in it, the special effects. Now, this movie makes use of both practical and digital special effects, and both are pretty darn good. I mean, they work really well. Sort of the nice thing a lot of times with horror movies is that the special effects are reasonably inexpensive, which is why a lot of indie filmmakers make horror movies, at least part of it, because it's not so expensive to do and get it to look right. But something like this, the special effects tend to be a little more difficult and involved. I mean, that's another of the reasons why people don't often film Lovecraft stuff, and when they do, it's often not that satisfying. So the practical effects tend to be the harder to pull off on a lower budget, I think. And they did a good job with that. But to me, probably the best aspect of the effects, I mentioned the psychedelic sort of feel to the movie. Well, a lot of that comes from the effects, the subtle side of the effects. Because when you're watching, I mean, when I watched the movie, I noticed that a lot of the colors in the movie I was like, how in the world did they ever get that? And it was just not any particular thing, although some of the animated creatures that's true of, but the just the general scenes and the atmosphere had these vibrant, just cool colors to them. And it turns out, watching the behind the scenes movie, or behind the scenes documentary, little featurette that's on the video, a lot of that came from post-production work and the visual effects. Those guys did an amazing job. I mean, the movie just looks so good. It's very beautiful and artsy looking. And that's just something that, you know, and like I say, I didn't even realize that was effects until afterward. I thought they had just managed to capture this look. So that's pretty impressive stuff. How does it vary from Lovecraft's book? Well, for one thing, it's set in the modern day, which I think was a wise choice. It's a lot better to make it resonate with modern movie fans. But that means that you've got to deal with electronics, because when Lovecraft did his story, there was no electronics like that. So I think they very well eliminated the electronics by having them interfered with, which meant that they were not an advantage to the characters in the movie. But it also is an aspect that seems like, had there been electronics based on the way that the story goes, it would have been interfered with anyway. Now, there's a time dilation sort of thing going on here. I mean, the story, which is told basically in the third person, but the story, it was like being related from someone who it was told to. But the story takes place over a long period of time, months and months, maybe even a year or two. And the book, or the movie, they sort of pulled that all together into just a matter of a few days. Now, I think for the immediacy of a movie and to keep the sort of pace of a film up, I think that was kind of a wise choice. It's a little jarring in terms of going from the story to the movie for that aspect, I think. They introduced a witchcraft element, which you'll see right at the beginning of the movie, very first scene, basically. And I'm not quite sure what that was about, unless it's... I don't really know why they went with that. I mean, there are some references to the fact that there was the witches and stuff in the area historically in the story. So I'm not sure if that was meant as sort of an homage to that. But, you know, I thought it was interesting anyway. There are bits of other Lovecraftian elements in there, and I may have missed some, but for one thing, the hydrologist. Now, in the movie, I believe it's a surveyor. I mean, in the book, but in fact, at one point, one of the characters calls him a surveyor, so that's kind of cool. But he is wearing a Miskatonic University T-shirt, and I believe he comes from Miskatonic University. The setting is the same, basically, as what Lovecraft set up in the story. In fact, they open it with a bit from Lovecraft's story by a narrator. And, you know, beyond that, Lovecraft didn't go into a ton of details on a lot of the graphic stuff. So that's kind of there for the filmmakers to put into place. I liked how, in Lovecraft's story, he says that the color is a color you can't really identify. So I liked how they sort of gave it a pinkish color at sometimes and a purple, because obviously if you're doing film, you're going to have to use a real color. But that make it so it's kind of like, okay, what color is it really? And I think they had the other thing is Lovecraft's story is pretty darn short. And to make that into a film, they had to add things. And I think adding the additional family members, although they never really, I don't think Lovecraft ever made it really clear just how many children Gardner had. Um, they made it different animals and things like that. And like I say, there's a lot of time dilation. And in fact, they talk at one point about time slowing down around the event horizon, basically. Like they compare it to a black hole. Now, I don't think that was intentionally there to explain why the time thing happened, but I think that was sort of another aspect that he was trying to throw in there, where time was like hard to measure and stuff. Um, so in any event, I think that it really did justice to the story while making some changes to bring it into contemporary times and getting into more detail that Lovecraft never really liked to provide. I think his thought and mine too is that a lot of times it's better if your imagination conjures up the images, because it's going to conjure something that's more uniquely frightening. But it doesn't really work well for film. Part of why Lovecraft is hard to adapt to film. But I think they did a really good job with it. I would just suggest, keep in mind, it's not a perfect film, but it is a very good film. It's very frightening. It has some great visuals, very good performances, and it does justice to H.P. Lovecraft's story, which is sometimes very difficult to do. So if you're into horror, which you wouldn't be watching this if you weren't, if you're interested in the movie, again, you wouldn't be watching this if you weren't, by all means, check it out. Now this section has spoilers, so if you haven't already seen the movie, please just shut off the video, walk away, unless you're okay with spoilers. Personally, I figure spoilers are fine. I mean, otherwise, why would you watch a movie over and over again? Because once you've seen it once, it's been spoiled. But if you're the kind of person that's averse to spoilers, please turn it off now. Okay, so a few of the things that I wanted to sort of address here. Nicolas Cage, when and I know a lot of people hate Nicolas Cage's acting. I personally do not. But I will say in this movie, when he was sort of channeling his father, which is just he's sort of imitating him early, and then later he sort of starts to transform into his father, which is kind of something that wasn't really in the story. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes that didn't work so well for me. It just sort of missed a little. I don't know. Then there's the Necronomicon. I mean, it's cool that they included it, but to make it look like a modern published book kind of loses the whole essence of what it is. It was supposed to be an arcane book passed down over the years, and to have this girl just sort of have a copy. I mean, maybe somebody translated it and printed it, but in effect, there are some books out there called the Necronomicon, which are kind of silly. But in my opinion, some people are into it, but whatever. Maybe that's what she was supposed to have. But the other thought I had was that maybe they were setting it up for the Dunwich Horror, which Stanley's going to do now. The only thing is, when you watch the video of the making of it, he hadn't really decided on doing that yet. It was something he was sort of knocking around the idea of. So I'm not sure that he would have put that Easter egg in there. Beyond that, I thought that, like I mentioned earlier, some of the monsters stuff looked really cool, but it also looked sort of derivative of Carpenter and The Thing. But then again, like I said, you can't do that without sort of having that. And so Tommy Chong's character, I thought he was a neat addition. I also thought they sort of played up by focusing mostly on the water, although they did say it was pretty much in everything. I think they sort of put in a modern anti-pollution sort of angle, but looking back at the Lovecraft story now, that was almost in there too. I don't really know if that was intentional, but it was there. So I'm not sure, perhaps I don't see that Lovecraft would have put that in there intentionally as for that, because number one, it really wasn't an issue at the time, and number two, I don't think it was something that he would have personally been all that involved in. But I did think there was a very subtle sort of anti-pollution sort of thing, and what you put in the water gets into everything, which is kind of a cool theme, particularly in these days. And the fact that they were going to open the reservoir and start letting the water go everywhere that was coming from that groundwater, basically, was kind of important too. So I don't know, that angle I kind of thought was cool, but I'm not really sure if they intended it. Maybe that was just something I saw. So I guess generally I didn't have a lot of spoilers here, but I really didn't want to talk about Nicolas Cage getting his father fixation or father channeling going on until someone had actually seen the movie. And I thought it was interesting that he locked his wife away in the attic, which is literally from the story. Although the whole transformation with the kid and everything, and the transformation like that wasn't really in the story, but he did kill his wife ultimately, which was in the story. The ending is a little different than the story in that it does it. There were like several witnesses, and the whole thing sort of fell apart. And I don't know. It just resolved a little differently than in the story, but it actually, I think that wasn't a big deal because I think those are just little details that aren't important to the general story. I mean, having just written my first science fiction novel length thing, novella length thing, I can tell you that you can rewrite the story over and over again, and the little details really aren't that important. They're just tools to telling the story, and it could go 100 different ways, because I've redone a lot of those things 100 different ways, just about. Well, not really 100, but it seems like it. So, I don't get too concerned about those little tiny details getting them right. I get concerned about the overall story and how it's being told. And I think that the ending that they did with the movie pretty much captured what the ending of the story was, without being specifically detail oriented the same. So, in general, that's the spoiler part of the review. So that's it. Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.